Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I am going to turn it over to, I'm going to hide my video and turn it over to Ted.
Actually, to Rob, I
Oh,
think.
sorry, I'm so sorry, to Rob. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Hey, thank you for joining us, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. Welcome to my house. And welcome to the first of Breakthrough's several, but hopefully not too many, because we'll be back in person soon. Seminars and discussions on climate issues and energy themes and all the normal breakthrough topics. This particular webinar is on a policy that a paper that just came out from one of our guests today, looking at, since we are now seemingly in a recession, what we could do and what we would, what kind of policies we could hope for that might both further decarbonization and also would be doable. So not just kind of, policies that we can think of that would be nice to have at the federal level at some point, but in fact policies that either where there's already a bill, or there's already been a lot of thinking, or there's already, in some cases, bipartisan energy behind them. So it's recovery, but realistic. It's low-hanging fruit for a potential COVID stimulus. I want to introduce the panelists briefly. Our first panelist and the author of the report is Laurie Anderson. She's a climate and energy analyst at Breakthrough. Our other guests today are Colin O'Mara, who's president and CEO of the National Wildlife Foundation here in DC, I believe, with me, though not actually with me. And finally is Brad, also perhaps with me, Brad Markell, who's the executive director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Council and who chairs the Energy Task Force for the AFL-CIO. I want to let you know, just before we get into it, that we'll kind of go through all the panelists, then we'll have a discussion here on Zoom, and then at the end, right around the 45-minute mark, we'll actually go to Q&A, and you have a wonderful little interface for Q&A, which also means I get to moderate your questions. And so if you are interested in asking questions of the panelists, please stick around, and we will have a Q&A at the end. So with that, welcome to the session. I think we're going to learn a lot and have a lot to think about today, and let's turn it to Ted.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for being here. This is kind of like a grand experiment. We're used to doing these things in-person convenings, and really like to kind of host really sort of interesting discussions. And so we're gonna sort of see how this whole webinar online Zoom interface works. So I'm just going to take like 2 minutes to offer a little bit of a sort of high-level overview of kind of at least our thinking on what the sort of opportunities for sort of climate and clean technology are right now, how the political moment has shifted, and sort of some context for this initial white paper, which will be the first of a number that we're hopefully will have out in the next couple of weeks. So I think it should be pretty clear to sort of most people that we kind of entered a very different political era than the period that we were in even, a month, 5-6 weeks ago, where, obviously we're dealing with sort of two interrelated emergencies at once, and neither of them is the climate emergency. We are dealing obviously with a public health emergency, with now upwards of 20,000 deaths and likely more on the way. And as a result of the necessary response of sheltering in place or locking down the entire economy essentially to keep the pandemic and public health crisis under control, a following economic crisis, which certainly is going to be, is very abrupt, going to be very deep, and it's an open question how extended it will be. So in that context, there was a lot of hope that sort of something around public opinion maybe had tipped prior to this around climate change. As Rob and others here probably know, have been skeptical of that. But nonetheless, what should be clear now is that sort of climate is not going to be a sort of top priority concern, certainly over the next year, I would argue. But there is a sort of political logic to the pandemic that I think does offer some really important opportunities for efforts to advance climate policy, clean technology, and decarbonization efforts. And you know, that logic kind of, I think everybody is catching up to that logic, including policymakers. So this initial stage that we've been in has been what I would call a sort of economic rescue phase, just literally trying to keep as many people, households, businesses afloat as possible. I think we were then going to move into a next stage, which I would call which is sort of the stimulus stage. And I think we're going to do a series of stimulus, and people say, well, maybe yes, maybe no. But I would argue that just the depth of this recession makes it almost inevitable that we're going to do a lot more stimulus. And then finally, I think as we sort of start to come out the other side of this in a context in which there's going to be a huge amount of economic damage, there's going to be a question about sort of longer term efforts for economic recovery. And in all of those, and particularly those latter two, stimulus and recovery, you know, our view is that there are quite extraordinary and unique opportunities to address climate change and advance decarbonization. All of those opportunities have to start with sort of the economic situation, the economic response, and economic recovery as the sort of central rationalization. If you can't make a strong case that this will contribute to the economic recovery and that it is a sort of key move to do it, it's just not going to have much traction right now. Climate benefits will come along as co-benefits, not as the sort of central rationale for taking these sorts of actions. But I think that if you look over the last sort of decade and more at how we actually do policy, and particularly how we spend money and do public investment at the federal level, I think that we've kind of, because of the sort of normal day-to-day dysfunction of Congress and the sort of federal sort of political system, basically we can only spend like big money on things like infrastructure in the midst of these emergencies. And I would call them sort of, we get these sort of moments where you get the normal rules are suspended and you have these festivals of appropriation. And I think that's what we are going to see over the next 4 to 6 months. We're going to spend an extraordinary amount of money on infrastructure, potentially technology, and for climate and clean energy and clean technology advocates, the question is what we can actually move through that window as that window opens in this sort of remarkable moment when all the normal rules of federal politics are suspended. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who can sort of walk through a little bit this first white paper, which is really what we call the low-hanging fruit, the really well-vetted, bipartisan things that are sort of already out there. And we think when Congress gets around to doing this first tranche of sort of infrastructure and technology investments, there's a bunch of things here that can be very, very important for decarbonization efforts that we should be trying to move through that window. So Lauren, take it away.
Thanks, Ted. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to give a quick overview of the policy brief so we can move on to discussion and questions. So Congress is going to need to start thinking through options for long-term recovery now in order to make sure we have multiple options available as we move forward. Through smart policy, it's going to be possible to reset the economy in a way that ensures long-term job growth and accelerates decarbonization. This memo pretty much is only focused on vetted bipartisan opportunities. Surprisingly, there's a lot out there. So we focused on 3 categories of potential investment: innovation, infrastructure, and incentives for clean technology deployment. Obviously, we're going to need to go beyond this. There's other opportunities out there that we can discuss later on. But to start with, innovation. So the federal government has an important role to play in developing new technologies, We're going to need new, cost-competitive options that can be deployed at scale, and in order to decarbonize challenging sectors of the economy, such as aviation and industrial processes. So there are a ton of bills out there. I'm not going to go through all of them. The American Energy Innovation Act combines over 50 innovation bills, though, and has broad bipartisan support. I'm not going to list all these bills, but I am going to go through each of the categories that falls within the bill. So there's nuclear energy, carbon removal, geothermal, energy storage, as well as other incentives such as for agriculture. Those aren't in the energy innovation bill, but it's also an important factor to consider. So moving on, the next area that this memo covered was infrastructure modernization. So we looked at transportation, the electrical grid, and natural infrastructure. The US is the wealthiest nation in the world, but our infrastructure is really not in great shape. So if we make these investments in a smart way, we can ensure infrastructure will support the economy far into the future, such as through clean energy and climate adaptation and a whole bunch of other areas. Another factor to consider with large infrastructure is that the permitting process takes a very long time. So the sooner we enact this legislation and get it moving, the quicker we can get shovel-ready projects out there. So starting with transportation, it is the nation's largest source of carbon pollution, but it also employs millions of Americans. And there's a reauthorization right now of the transportation bill with a $10 billion climate title. So this would be a great place to start. For the electrical grid, there is no federal legislation out there right now that really covers this issue adequately. So we recommended implementing the recommendations of NREL's interconnection seam study report. That would basically deploy high capacity interregional transmission lines and support variable wind and solar. Another topic that's really important to cover is natural infrastructure. This may be a new concept to a lot of people, but it's equally as important as traditional infrastructure. Protecting, managing, restoring our natural lands is going to be very important for climate adaptation, climate mitigation. It also supports the outdoor recreation economy, which is a huge source of income and employment in the United States. The Great American Outdoors Act addresses a lot of these issues and would be a great place to start. The last area is focused on low carbon growth. So there's been controversy around extending certain tax credits for wind and solar, but there's actually been really broad bipartisan support for new and emerging technologies like energy storage and offshore wind. However, given the recent economic downturn, the focus now is on keeping as many jobs out there as we possibly can. And so this means that those technologies that we thought maybe wouldn't need an extension of the tax credits actually now could really benefit from them. It would help stabilize the continuing growth of those industries. It would really reduce the number of jobs lost going into the future. So the 2009 stimulus bill included $90 billion for clean energy, and it really set the stage for these industries. And so clean energy tax credits, energy efficiency incentives, and agriculture conservation incentives are all incredibly valuable moving forward. And that is a very high-level overview. Happy to dive into some more details.
Thanks so much. I think let's first let Colin respond. And I think Colin's going to talk a little bit about natural infrastructure as well.
Great. No, thanks, Rob, and great to be with Lauren and Brad and Ted. And thank you all of you for chiming in from whatever bunker you're in right now across the country. So my name's Colin O'Mara. I'm the head of the National Wildlife Federation. We're America's largest wildlife conservation organization with 6 million members in pretty much every place. But we also kind of sit in an interesting spot in the community, and that we're kind of the most moderate of the green groups, kind of the most progressive of the sportsman groups, and increasingly kind of a lead partner with labor on a lot of things. And also do a lot of work with the environmental justice community. And so I just want to talk a little bit about how the types of kind of common sense bipartisan measures that Lauren and Ted teed up really have to be at the epicenter of the first tranche that comes after we got to deal with the immediate response around, first responders and state governments and small businesses. I want to start with just two basic numbers. Now, the first one is that, the numbers as of today have us at about 22 million individuals unemployed. That number is low and soft because there's still a challenge getting into the system in many states. We're probably looking at more like 25 to 28 million individuals that have filed for unemployment. And then on top of that, there's some recent studies that show that we might have as many as 30 to 35% of all people under 35 years old being unemployed right now. And in that context, it's also important to think where they are, right? I mean, we're starting to think about this. This is very different than 2009. You have regions of the country that are absolutely underwater now because of the nature of the vectors of the virus. You also have a lot of places that are actually absorbing massive impacts because of the dramatic decline in oil consumption and kind of combined with a global glut that's being kind of created for geopolitical reasons, combined with places like the outdoor economy, as Lauren mentioned, an $887 billion economy that right now no one's really participating in a big way because no one's really traveling. So as much as folks are enjoying their trail by their backyard or trying to get to a park occasionally, safely of course, all of a sudden that entire economy is collapsing as well. And we're also seeing big declines in the clean energy economy. And so building on Ted's point before, it's going to be critical that the solutions that we propose deal with the economic reality that we're facing right now in both the sectors and the demographics and the regions that are most hard hit. And so I'd like to use my couple minutes just to pitch a little bit to think about natural infrastructure as one of those places, because you both are going to be employing in places that are being incredibly hard hit right now. And it's also a very efficient way to create jobs. And during the New Deal, one of the reasons that FDR invested so much in the Civilian Conservation Corps, he ended up putting almost 3 million people to work in the Civilian Conservation Corps because it was a very cost-effective way to put people to work quickly. Now, the reason for that is that you spend most of the money on labor and not as much on materials and other equipment. And so it's a way to put folks to work really quickly. And I like to argue that it's one of the reasons why the greatest generation became the greatest generation. They were kind of forged reforesting and building the parks in this country. And so when you think about, kind of the places we can put jobs kind of together quickly, we have required a lot of plans across this country over the last 10 years. We have NEPA ready kind of plans for national parks and wildlife refuges and forest plans. And we have plans for our Bureau of Land Management plans. We have plans for reclamation. We have plans for ecological restoration for the Army Corps. We have plans at the state level for state wildlife action plans, and state forest action plans, and state comprehensive recreation plans. We mandate all these things and we don't really fund them. And so you have a series of shovel-ready projects that could put together between 17 and 31 jobs per $1 million you spend that could really kind of put people to work in all places. When you think about like investing in reclamation or investing in plugging abandoned wells or cleaning up hard rock mines or reforesting, many of these are the exact places where unemployment is spiking right now. I mean, you could put a ton of folks to work in the fossil fuel industry, actually kind of fixing pipes across the country, whether that's methane or for water. The emission reductions are significant. And I'll end with this kind of final thing. I would argue there's no greater bang for your buck in terms of achieving multiple objectives at the same time than investments in natural infrastructure. Not only are you going to put people to work and have very high rates of employment, you're going to reduce emissions because these are all, when you invest in reforestation, you're going to be sequestering carbon out of the air. Same thing with wetlands, same thing with grasslands. And so the restoration value does create opportunities to kind of change that baseline and sequester a bunch of carbon. You bolster the resilience of communities. A lot of times these natural defenses help make communities much more resilient. So when you have healthy wetlands, you can withstand the punch of a hurricane better. Or if you have healthy riparian corridors, you can manage flooding better, and healthy forests obviously are less fire susceptible. And at the same time, you improve air quality, improve water quality, and bolster the outdoor economy, and frankly help diversify the energy economy. And so it's a way to achieve multiple objectives at the same time. And I think, frankly, one of the challenges by a lot of folks that are in jobs like mine is that if they hit too hard on just the climate piece of this and don't focus on jobs and don't focus on workers, these things that could be common sense and very bipartisan, all of a sudden could become much more controversial. And so I'm kind of imploring everyone that's working on this, that's on this call today, to be leading with people in jobs first. Because if we don't figure out a way to help the tens of millions of people that are out of work right now, none of these ideas are going to move at the pace or the scale that we need. So with that, let me turn it back to Rob.
Thanks so much. I want to just say, I want to get one question before we go to Brad, who I think you've just given the perfect segue to by talking about jobs and job quality and some of the divisive aspects of talking about climate in the political sphere. When you say shovel ready, where are those jobs? Like, where is the list of those shovel ready jobs? Like, are those in state departments of natural resources? Are those at the county level? Because I think everyone knows there's infrastructure that needs to be worked on. In this case, there's natural infrastructure that needs to be worked on. But then when it comes time to actually fund these things, there's always a ton of confusion, especially in DC, about like what can actually take money and what's being overfunded and what's not being funded enough. So like, first of all, is your organization doing the work to collate those plans and to get them in one place? And second of all, like where are those projects being stored right now, almost at the physical level? Like where are those lists?
Yeah, no, thanks, Rob. No, I appreciate the question. I mean, we and this may be too kind of geeky, but like we're increasingly trying to use the term like NEPA ready. So things that have gone through the EIS process, because I mean, I think one of the things we saw last time was by having a very broad definition of what's a major physical, major federal action, you had a whole lot of projects that got delayed significantly because of this infusion of federal money that probably would have been done quicker if local money had been used. And so I'm thinking about like all the Army Corps projects that have been authorized through previous Water Resource Development Acts. I'm thinking through things that are already in the Transportation Trust Fund, the 5-year plans that could be expedited. I'm thinking about things like recovery plans for endangered species that have already been vetted, already gone through EIS, have been litigated to death, that are ready to go. I'm thinking about the parks maintenance backlog, and there's similar backlogs for the Forest Service and the wildlife refuges and the BLM lands. And so it's those types of things that have already gone through a planning process, already gone through public comment, already in some cases already been litigated. I mean, we have dozens of national forest plans right now that have already gone through litigation, gone through the collaborative process, have been attacked 6 ways to Sunday. It can't get funded right now because up until 2 years ago, we were spending all the money on fighting fires. And so it's that universe of things that already have plans that are approved, that are through the NEPA gauntlet, that are ready to go.
I think NEPA ready is a great phrase and a great preview of what we may discuss a little later. But first, I want to go to Brad to respond to both of the previous panelists. Brad, as I introduced at the beginning, is the executive director of the AFL-CIO Industrial Council, and he chairs the Energy Task Force for the AFL-CIO as well. And he's also someone who I think has a lot of experience here and is quite wise.
That's what you get for being the old guy, Rob. Thank you. And thanks to Breakthrough. Nice to be with Colin for really fun discussion. I'm going to start really at the end, the last of the 3 segments, and what Colin picked up on. Things like there's a growing interest in labor around resilience and adaptation, and these big projects that are undone out there, as Colin was mentioning. The Ohio River, for example, is still a mess. You know, the Missouri River is a little bit of a mess if you haven't noticed. And the abandoned mine fund, we would probably be pushing when the time comes for a very large spend on abandoned mines, because as we talk about just transition and what's happened in the coal economy, that's one spending program that drives money directly to those communities. And the mine workers tell us they think there's about 15 or 20 years worth of work there that could be done. And all those are investments into the recreational economy and to returning the land to what it was. And, you know, I think there's a lot to be done around the management of forests, and a lot of jobs that need to be created in an era when forest fires and large fires are an increased risk because of climate change. So that's sort of a quick look. Labor's got a real increasing interest in resilience and adaptation projects, and I think that the abandoned mines would be toward the top of our list. We, of course, have always been in favor of an innovation agenda. Labor has, for a long time, wanted to plus up just about every category of innovation you could find in the federal government, from EERE and the Advanced Manufacturing Office to some stuff in fossil that we would like to see, but also just, you know, Manufacturing USA and new materials. Some people know that I used to work on the fuel economy stuff when I was at the UAW, and you know, if we can make carbon fiber into a reality for the auto industry, then, you know, 54 miles a gallon will be just kind of like a starting point, right? Because you can cut the weight of a car in half. if you've got carbon fiber plus electric. So it's all very interesting. Nuclear is high on our list. Carbon capture is high on our list. The Recovery Act from 10 years ago, provision 48C for clean energy manufacturing. A lot of jobs in the clean energy economy are manufacturing jobs. Folks have heard me say before that a defining feature of the clean energy economy is spending that used to be on fuels becomes spending on manufactured items. So that means if we're not making turbines and blades and solar panels and batteries and all the components of electric cars, we're missing out quite a bit on the jobs that could be created. And the shifting value chain in the energy sector really shifts a lot of things towards manufacturing. Offshore wind could be a way bigger job creator if we land the manufacturing that we think we can or we hope we can. What else? I think, we want to see a large infrastructure package, and the time will come to advocate for that. I do take Colin's point that there are a lot of existing programs that we can fund, and I don't think we necessarily need to reinvent the wheel here. We even need to find the political will to push the money into the right places. And so we have a worker focus, of course, jobs and job quality. As you can imagine, the work of the AFL-CIO has kind of been overtaken by this crisis and what's happening with working people and the kind of things that, we are trying to demand in legislation, the kind of safety standards, helping stand up food banks and all that. But there is going to come a time, and I think that is going to be hastened on May 8th when we get the jobs report from April and we find out that unemployment is 14 or 17%. In places like Michigan, it's going to be 20, 25%. And we're going to find that the rate is probably a little artificially low because people have left the labor market. So the participation rate is going to go down. And that will really ramp up the call for something to be done. I think you saw this idea about virtual oil in the SPR, and I think a lot of refineries are hurting. And I think when those two things sort of come to the fore, that is going to enable a moment where the Republicans are going to want to do something, and there's going to be space for the kind of things that we're talking about here today. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Fred. I want to ask quickly, when you mentioned job quality briefly, and obviously I think as you know, and as many folks on the listening will know or watching, how to talk about job quality and just the labor, green, climate connection has been troubled in the past. I'll put it like that. And there have been political issues that came out of that, and programs that maybe could have helped and didn't wind up going through. And so I just want to ask you, like, how would you recommend to this audience that we think about job quality, and that we think of, that how would you say that, how would you recommend that these programs, like Lauren talked about, how should we talk about those in terms of job quality? Like, what should we look for? What really matters there?
Well, as the construction of your question shows, Rob, it's a rather vexing question. I mean, the first thing is, like, if you think about what workers are facing with climate change and the need to bring up new industries and watching old sectors have reduced employment, they're facing that in the face of 30 or 40 years of bad news for workers, right? Every time there was a big change, workers got the short end of the stick, going back to, free trade or deregulation or outsourcing or you name it. And this feels like a pretty big change, and people are really worried. If you look over the course of what's happened with inequality and the attack on the labor movement and the decline of unionization, it tracks with the decline of equality in the United States. And even the auto industry, where I came from, right? Auto workers for the past 20 years have seen a large drop in the real wage, which is crazy because investment per capital per worker in productivity in the auto industry are extremely high. The value added per worker in auto assembly is approaching $400,000 per year. Yet you've seen these 15, 20% decreases in auto workers' wages. You've seen the rise of temps. So we need to swim upstream against all that stuff in order to create a green economy that's, makes the newer green jobs look like the old jobs, right? You're not going to convince somebody who works for Detroit Edison, and I sort of joke around that if I had known how much Detroit Edison pays, I never would have taken a job with General Motors. That if I make 35, 40 bucks an hour, all of a sudden solar rooftop at 18 with no benefits looks good. It doesn't look good. And so thinking through that worker voice gap, if you're not familiar with the work of Thomas Koken up at MIT, there's a huge voice gap on workers, thinking through what that means for people's representation on the job and how we as workers can make our jobs better. The PRO Act might be the most pro-climate thing we can do because it actually loosens up people's fear about what's going to happen if they have to change jobs.
Yeah. And if I can just jump in just
Thank
for
you.
1 second.
No, please.
Yeah, and look, I think there's been a failing generally in the environmental community about not standing up for wages in the clean energy space, right? And so if somebody's making, to Brad's example, 30 bucks in the fossil fuel space and the job is 12 to 14 bucks in the clean energy space, like that income loss is real. And we can't be, and also we've seen pretty aggressive hostility among some of the clean tech leaders towards unionization. And so, when Lauren was talking about different policy options, the tax credits obviously are there. It's not going to be much tax appetite. It's not going to have any, tax liability. If we move towards more of a 1603 grant program, connecting to things like Davis-Bacon and some other labor standards, so we're getting better quality, kind of payments in return for the clean energy, even some Buy American provisions. I mean, I do think linking these things together is going to be important. I think there's some real talk that the Greens have to have about the economic realities facing folks. And I'll just give you 2 other quick examples. And the first one is on mining. I would rather have things sourced here if we're going to try to, build up a true, kind of net zero economy rather than having supply chains that are entirely based overseas. That's an anathema for a lot of my colleagues, the idea of having any mining, let alone, kind of critical components that we're going to need for clean energy. Just to fight over lithium alone before you get to copper and other things. I mean, these are real conversations that have to take place. And the second one, it's just around manufacturing capacity. I mean, it's an embarrassment right now that we have to try to beg around the globe to try to get PPE for first responders because we have no capacity to build any of this stuff in this country right now. And so we could wind up in the same position in clean energy. And so I just think, like, as opposed to just focusing on the outcome of number of gigawatts or tons of emissions, we have to be focusing on the entire supply chain. And frankly, that's a way to make it more bipartisan. Hopefully, maybe not all the labor pieces that Brad and I want, but at least the workforce and manufacturing competitive piece that changes the paradigm a little bit in the way that Ted's been working on for years.
Thanks so much. I want to get to the minerals in a second and also the domestic production. I first just want to go to Lauren and first of all, thank you for your presentation and say, how much of what there are a lot of bills and you gloss them, and there are bills within bills, and there's projects within those bills, and there's ideas, there's recommendations where there's not bills. I really like Colin's standard of NEPA ready. How many of those bills don't just point to programs, but point to NEPA ready projects, point to things that would actually get money out the door sooner rather than later? Because I think what we've already seen with this emergency and what we saw to some degree with the 2009 Recovery Act is that to some degree it takes a long time for money to get out the door. And let's say the charismatic mega projects like high-speed rail are actually the ones, the projects that are kind of envisioned to be the FDR style emblems of the bill are the ones that take the longest to get out the door. And now I realize this is the low-hanging fruit white paper, more will come later, but like how much from these, what's the level of NEPA ready or shovel ready project that's kind of already represented by the legislation you looked at?
Yeah, so, it's good to distinguish between innovation infrastructure and sort of these incentives. The second we fund this innovation package and fund all of the federal incentives, that's immediately going to invest money in jobs and new research, new development. But switching to the infrastructure package, I think that is really the key, is looking at infrastructure specifically to determine what is shovel ready. And when it comes to transportation and the electrical grid, investments in those areas, states do have shovel ready projects that they just need funding for. They need, you know, a higher level of federal planning and smart siting policy to determine where these projects should go, especially when they cross state borders. So you do have projects that are ready to go in the transportation space and in updating the electrical grid when it comes to building new transmission lines. But again, the sooner we get these you know, policies enacted, the sooner we're going to be able to start in on the actual details of permitting and go beyond sort of those projects that are already ready and planned at the state level, and really start building out a regional plan for how we're going to invest in the economy and reset these infrastructure systems in a way that really does support decarbonization and long-term growth.
Ted, do you want to jump in here?
Yeah, just I'll add two things. You know, the first is, you know, and I think Colin sort of gave a nod to this, and you know, it's been sort of a third rail for the environmental community to talk about NEPA, to talk about citing, to talk about permitting. We got to have a conversation about this. I mean, when you look at, you know, I'm less a, you know, not anywhere close to 100% renewables guy, but if you want to see like big renewable shares of the US economy, like you got to figure out how you're going to build transmission. You got to figure out how you're going to go site big industrial wind and solar projects, and, you know, high-speed rail and a bunch of other stuff. And right now it's just extraordinarily difficult to do it, and it takes a really long time. I think there's going to be an opportunity as we move forward into this, you know, into this space, you know, in the coming months, hopefully to have that conversation. I hope we can figure out how to have it in a constructive way. I'll say the second thing on the shovel ready question, I think there's a bunch of stuff here that is shovel ready. I think we also, we tend to kind of also, when we say shovel ready, we think about guys in hard hats. But, you know, look, kind of planning, engineering, all of that is, you know, not necessarily guys in hard hats, but their jobs. And this is a moment where, you know, the entire economy is under extraordinary stress. And then just the last point I'll quickly make is, you know, I am not a kind of public policy school kind of policy guy. And I will just say that there's a bunch of stuff when that stimulus window, you know, if you go back and look at ARA, there's a bunch of stuff that we are going to fund through these stimulus efforts that are not going to be according to Hoyle's stimulus. And we should still do it because that's how we do these things now. So I would not get sort of too literal about the shovel ready stuff. I think we should move as much of that stuff as we can. I think we should expedite permitting. We should, you know, look really seriously about how to expedite this stuff. And I think we should recognize that we can and should fund a bunch of stuff that may take longer to actually kind of happen, because we're not going to get another shot at it for a long time, likely.
Colin, what do you think the appetite is for some kind of solution, or let's say some kind of bargain around permitting? Because I think there's wide recognition at this point that certainly it could be better. And you can see that even in, you know, New York State opening a whole office just for working out permitting around renewable energy. Do you think there is appetite? Do you think there is capital, political or otherwise, for some kind of bargain around changing how we do permitting, or loosening permitting rules for certain kinds of infrastructure, be it renewables or certain kinds of transportation infrastructure? Like, how feasible is it that we could get something like that during this particular Festival of Appropriation?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the National Wildlife Federation actually, you know, had the pen for part of the creation of NEPA, working with Scoop Jackson back in the day. I mean, I think the conversation has to take place. And I think there's two ideas I'll just put on the table that we're trying to work on with some folks. Is the first one's a series of general nationwide permits, the way we have for different types of wetland permits. We're basically saying, look, if it's a repair and replace kind of thing related to pipelines, water systems, transmission, I mean, if you're in the existing right-of-ways, all of a sudden you can basically assume that it's already gone through that level of review, right? Because you're basically just using that same infrastructure. The second one is actually proactively identifying areas like renewable energy leasing areas. And this was an idea that Ken started several years ago. It kind of got dropped by the wayside. But rather than having kind of the wild, wild west, the way we do for oil and gas and for hard rock minerals, like why not identify the places that make sense and basically say like you're going to get expedited in those areas and make it real this time. I mean, right now, if you want your head to hurt in the clean energy space, look at the number of projects that are moving on public lands, and the number's almost zero. I mean, like you ask wind developers where they want to develop, they will look everywhere in the country they possibly can before they consider federal lands. And that's just a staggering failure of leadership. And this isn't partisan. This is a kind of across multiple administrations. And so, I mean, I do think that being very systematic about the types of activities we want to see, there's efforts during ARA where we should be treating folks that are moving dirt for restoration different than folks that are moving dirt for like housing developments. But yet, a lot of times, if federal money is involved, you get to the same types of pieces. So I'm not sure there's going to be a ton of appetite to rewrite the entire statute, particularly given some of the things this administration's tried to do to some pieces that are pretty counterproductive. But I do think that there's going to be appetite to basically have a different kind of permanent regime for some of these big projects of national significance, and really trying to make sure they're placed in the right areas.
Yeah, I would hold up the Desert Renewable Energy Plan in the deserts of California as a great example of multiple stakeholders coming together and really thinking through where you can smartly site projects that will have the least impacts on all of the competing uses for public land. So, biodiversity conservation, recreation, there's a whole bunch of different uses, and it is possible for stakeholders to come together and think through where these big projects that we're going to need can go, sort of the path of least resistance. So it is possible to do. It's happened before. It's been a success. And I think there really is a lot of growing recognition out there that, we're going to need big infrastructure to decarbonize. It's not going to be enough to have rooftop solar and microgrids. We're going to need big wind farms, big solar farms, big offshore wind farms. We're going to need to have massive transmission upgrades and expansions go in order to move these resources across the country to where they're needed, especially since we don't have the technologies in place for long-term energy storage yet. And we're also going to need to start looking at a big infrastructure push around negative emissions. So we're going to need storage facilities. We're going to need carbon dioxide pipelines, direct air capture facilities, all of those technologies as they start to expand. We're going to need big projects. And I think that there really is growing recognition for that need. And all of those projects create jobs. So there's a ton of potential there, and we hope that it's recognized going forward.
Well, look, I'm happy to hear this. I think everybody recognizes there's a very large appetite in the labor community for permitting reform, large enough that several union presidents showed up at the White House a couple months ago to talk about it. And the grid stuff is what really drives us crazy, because there's probably $8 or $10 billion in private investment that could be unlocked if we could get grid permitting done. We were very supportive during the Obama administration of the power purchase agreement and federal corridor moves that the DOE made. They were kind of unconventional, but the logjam just drives us crazy. And there's a lot of support in labor probably to go a lot further than folks here are comfortable with. But it's just a level, it's an example of how frustrated we could be when we can't get these investments unlocked and get these jobs created. In this case, it's holding us up on wind. There's a lot more wind potential in the wind belt that is really struggling to figure out how do we get it to the load centers. And the answer is to build it.
Thanks so much. I want to first say this is your opportunity, if you have questions for the panelists, to drop them in the Q&A window. We have about 10 minutes left. You'll notice there's both at the bottom of your screen, there's both a Q&A and a chat. It's slightly easier if you use the Q&A interface, so just maybe prefer that one. But before we get there, I want to ask Lauren one last question, which is, we know there's a lot of things, there's a lot of money that's about to get spent. We also know there's going to be a lot of money that tries to get spent and doesn't. It doesn't make it, right? Like programs that won't actually make the cut. And so given that this is the open window, what is the one policy or the two policies that you think the clean economy or clean energy really needs to keep making the progress that it's already made since the last recession, and to kind of keep having a strategic leg up on fossil or any of the any aspect of the carbon economy? Like, what is the one policy that that we really need for decarbonization here, and that would specifically kind of like allow the industry to keep moving and to keep moving forward? Does something leap to mind?
I think, I hate to choose just one, but if I had to, I would go with innovation as the place where you start. It's the place where you start, it's the place where you should end. We think of these technologies, they're gonna have to continue to compete in a marketplace that is changing rapidly within the US and internationally. The US has been a world leader in developing new and innovative technologies, and if it wants to stay at the forefront of the development of the clean energy economy, it's going to need to invest in constantly improving these technologies. How do you reduce costs? How do you, get these technologies deployed quickly and cost effectively and scale them up to the level that we need to like decarbonize every sector of the economy? You really need to keep investing in new ideas and new research and development. That is especially true for challenging sectors of the economy. There are ways to improve wind and solar. These are tried and true and proven clean energy generation sources, but we're going to need to decarbonize the industrial sector, the agriculture sector, transportation sector. These are just as big and as challenging, if not more challenging, than decarbonizing the power sector. And we don't have all the technologies that we need yet. So really focusing on things like carbon removal and energy storage, nuclear power, all of this has an incredible potential. So if I had to choose, I would choose that one. But yeah.
But of course you couldn't choose. Thanks. I see questions coming in. The first one I want to hit, and any of the panelists should feel free to take a quick swing at any of these, but also in the interest of time, the shorter is better, so we can more do it. Also, if we aren't able to get to questions, you can always follow up online. David Douglas asked, the pendulum was already moving away from globalization, and it seems like COVID will reinforce that trend. Clearly, seems like money for solar panels from China might not be as popular a proposal right now. And it also seems like, separately, just adding my own end, that there's suddenly a lot more interest in domestic production and an industrial policy than basically I can remember. What other effects might you see might happen as a result of this moment? From moving around away from globalization, like how would that affect our specific policies that are already in play? Ted, do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'll say this, I think it's really early days. I mean, I think the thing that we know, if you even just go back to the last, to the financial crisis, there was really, it drove, these sort of big economic shocks tend to drive a lot of structural change in both sort of national economies and the global economy. And so on one level, I feel like, I'm not sure, like, I mean, globalization is such a sort of sweeping, big single thing. I think the more, for me, the more interesting questions are kind of, how is this going to sort of start to change the sort of, even if you look at the power sector, you look at the latest EIA numbers for 2020, and coal generation just collapses even from where it is. I'm not sure how much of that coal comes back. And, we saw this after the last recession too. There was a lot of demand destruction. And that really was sort of the moment that really begins the coal to gas transition in the United States. And I think it's I think that, like, the power sector, parts of the transportation sector, the industrial sector, a lot of this stuff may look quite different as we come out of this, in the years out of this, than it did going into it. And I don't think we know what that looks like, but I'll just say one thing, which is that I think that as we get into like the second half of this year and potentially a new administration next year, there are going to be really interesting questions and opportunities around sort of recapitalizing and retooling entire sectors of the US economy, particularly if this sort of depression really that we are going into right now is as deep and as sustained as it potentially could be. So I would kind of expand that question to just kind of go like, look at these from a climate perspective, look at these energy and carbon intensive sectors of the US economy. And I think it's sort of almost imperative right now to start thinking about the ways in which we may see some very, very substantial structural shifts in a whole set of those sectors. And in the coming weeks and months, I think we're going to kind of start to produce a set of white papers and thought pieces about sort of potentially what that looks like as we get a bit more clarity about sort of, I think we're going to even start to see in the coming months sort of what the sort of fallout looks like, and sort of kind of that's going to, there's going to be a lot of economic dislocation there, but it's also, I think, going to create opportunities to sort of rebuild a bunch of those sectors pretty differently as we kind of, as the smoke clears from the rubble of the American economy. Not to be too dramatic about it, but.
Well, I will just say a few things. I think what Lauren said about the innovation economy is really, really important to labor and those investments to bear fruit. We talk a lot about RD&D, the deployment part, and finding things that are sort of ready to be pulled forward and deployed, and things that are a little further out, like direct air capture, which we're very interested in. It's really, I think, important for us to try to put together a vision that pulls people around this idea that we can organize a different kind of economy that allows people to take a lot more risk with what they're doing. We did a future of work process inside the AFL-CIO, the future of work in unions. There were sector reports, a non-public energy sector report in which we talked a lot about shifting value chains and where the industry is going. But we talked also about creating wins and building the political will to move forward and for working people and for communities to see something positive. And so if we could get wins in these investment areas, in cleaning up abandoned mines, in investing, seeing grid investments flow, in seeing investments in carbon capture, which are politically very, very important. And we could argue about where they fit into the technology scheme. But, as I said earlier this year in an interview, any energy legislation or, that doesn't really put a big pot of money on carbon capture probably is not going to get the support of the labor movement. Whether you like it or don't like it, there's a huge constituency for it. And the IPCC literature is pretty clear. There's a lot of literature out there about carbon capture. And it's just something that, has a lot of political leverage to it.
Yes. And there's another question in here that was getting at the question of, do we have to wait until the next administration to do some of this stuff? And the answer is no. You look about the investments that can be made now, and our memo tallies up about 500 billion in investments in low-hanging fruit right now, and that would also support about 9 million jobs. This is ready to go out the door now. The surface transportation bill, which is close to $300 billion investment, is it's up for reauthorization this year. It needs to be enacted into law. And the same for the energy innovation package. It has bipartisan support. It ran into some political challenges moving through, but that innovation package is pulled together and ready to go. So this stuff does not need to wait until the next administration. We need it as soon as possible.
Do you see the Trump administration supporting these packages particularly you, Lauren, do you see the Trump administration supporting these packages and being a little more flexible and signing on to some stuff that they've previously opposed in the past, be it energy innovation or do you see their window opening because of the emergency of the moment?
I mean, I'd hope so. Yes, I do. You know, infrastructure is like the thing that never dies in DC. The Trump administration has brought it up as a priority numerous times. The pressure for supporting all of that job growth is growing. And the innovation package is something that has broad bipartisan support. And I think it is something that could very much be supported by the Trump administration. Colin, did you have anything to add to political feasibilities?
I just don't think he's going to have a choice. I think if we're really at 25% unemployment, I think the fight's going to be between the White House and the Senate leadership. I think you're going to see, and the challenge for the kind of the government in waiting that's camped out in my home state of Delaware right here, is trying to figure out how to make sure there's enough good work to try to restore the economy while still facing the reality that if the Republicans are in the minority, we'll likely see a replay of 2009, where all of a sudden fiscal conservatism returns and you're in a fight or not getting the level of investment we need to get out of the hole that we're in. And so I think now is the moment. And look, I mean, I don't see how anyone's gonna be looking at the numbers that we're seeing and assuming that there's gonna be this sharp V that people keep talking about. It just there's no evidence in the last 100 years that suggests a recovery that's as rapid as the kind of crisis that preceded it.
I'll just, one second, 30 seconds is the window that needs to open is in the Senate, not at the White House. And as I was saying earlier, when the unemployment report hits on May 8th, a lot of eyes are going to get opened. And then you combine that with the thing I mentioned earlier, that when the drillers and the refiners come to Washington looking for money, then we've got the elements of a deal that the Republicans need to accept.
Yeah, and I just to add one further, to my original comment about these sort of emergencies where the normal rules get suspended and you kind of have these sort of festivals of appropriation. One of the things in sort of not even suspended, but reversed, suddenly, like, the bigger the number, the better. Like the Trump administration, and obviously, congressional Democrats, and I think the Senate is going to be hard pressed ultimately to resist it. The sort of imperative is going to be to move as much money as you can in these packages.
I don't think anybody wants to run without having passed an infrastructure package of some sort.
Yep, exactly. So I think
week what 185 by that point will be actual infrastructure week in DC.
I think there's this interesting dynamic that's emerged where Stephen Mnuchin and Nancy Pelosi are basically willing to spend money. It's to the political benefit of Trump, at least before the election. And then the question is, will the Senate be in session? And then what will they put up with? One last thing, and then we'll go. And I want to first of all thank all the participants for coming, for watching us. For participating. Apologies, we were not able to get to nearly as many questions as we could, but we're still figuring out all the kinks of this format. And a benefit of this format is you can email any of us or approach us on Twitter, where many of us will go as soon as this event is over. It's so funny thinking back to what you just said, Colin, and Brad, and how many things, how the political environment will change again when the next jobs report comes out, and when we suddenly have an unemployment number that is concrete and not one of the approximations that we've been seeing so far. In early March, right before I got pulled into actually just reporting on the COVID pandemic full time, I had kind of talked to my editor, and there was this thought that, interest rates are pretty low, and this COVID thing seems like,
and my headphones just died, so you're gonna get ambient. But this COVID thing seems like a big deal, and we should really start thinking about like what would happen if Congress were to pass a bill, in the next 6 months, where it might want to do something of some sort to help the economy. Little did we know, of course, that 3 weeks later, there was the first emergency bill, and that probably many more pieces of legislation would follow. So things can change extremely fast, and things that seem impossible or just utterly unlikely and not within the window of feasibility 1 week, we've already seen them change so fast just in the last month. And so I'm glad that we have this list of low-hanging fruit, in part so I can go ask members of Congress about it. And I want to thank you all for your time. Thank you, Lauren, for your work. Thanks, Ted, for hosting. Colin and Brad, thanks for being here. If you're a participant, thank you for being here and for your participation. And Ted, if it sounds good to you, I think we're good to close. And
yes, thanks everybody. And thanks so much, Rob, for doing a great job moderating. And we're gonna have a bunch more of these since you're all now captive audiences. And every day is the same. So we're gonna try to at least provide some new content for your days. So thanks so much everybody for participating. It's been great, great doing this, and more to come.
Thanks for having us. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.